There's a question that haunts almost every empath who has survived a relationship with a narcissist, one that surfaces late at night, in therapy sessions, in quiet moments of painful reflection long after the relationship has ended. Why me? Why, out of every person in the room, did he choose her? Why did he zero in on her with such precision, such apparent instinct, as though he could sense something about her before she'd said more than a few sentences? Why does this pattern seem to repeat, sometimes across multiple relationships, multiple friendships, multiple professional dynamics, as though she's somehow wearing a sign invisible to everyone except the exact people capable of causing her the most devastating harm? The answer to this question is more precise, more mechanical, and in some ways more unsettling than most empaths initially realize. Because narcissists don't choose their targets randomly, and they don't choose based on some mysterious, unknowable instinct that defies explanation. They choose based on specific, identifiable traits that happen to overlap almost perfectly with the exact qualities that make empaths who they are. Today, we're going to walk through exactly why empaths become narcissists' favorite targets, not to make you feel like a victim of some unavoidable fate, but because understanding this mechanism with total clarity is precisely what allows you to interrupt it permanently. And by the end of this, you're going to understand something that changes everything about how you see your own sensitivity, your own compassion, your own capacity for love. Not as flaws that made you vulnerable, but as a kind of resource so valuable that predators specifically evolved strategies to exploit it. Let's start with the first, most fundamental reason, because it explains almost everything else that follows. Empaths offer something narcissists cannot generate on their own: genuine emotional depth. Here's a truth about narcissistic psychology that doesn't get discussed nearly often enough, because it complicates the simpler, more satisfying narrative of the narcissist as pure predator, entirely in control, calculating every move with cold precision. The reality is more complicated, and in some ways more disturbing. Narcissists don't just exploit emotional depth because it's convenient. They're drawn to it because they genuinely lack it themselves. And on some level, however unconscious, they're desperately searching for access to something they cannot produce internally. This might sound almost sympathetic, and in a limited sense, it is. Narcissistic personality structures typically develop from genuine early wounding, environments where authentic emotional connection was unsafe or unavailable, forcing a child to develop an elaborate false self designed to secure attention and validation in the absence of genuine attunement. But understanding the origin of this deficit doesn't excuse what happens next, because a narcissist doesn't respond to this internal emptiness by doing the difficult work of developing genuine emotional capacity. Instead, he learns to find people who already possess it in abundance, and to attach himself to their emotional richness as a substitute for developing his own. This is precisely why narcissists are so magnetically drawn to empaths specifically, rather than simply to anyone kind or agreeable. An empath doesn't just offer pleasant company or occasional emotional support. She offers access to an entire world of feeling, depth, nuance, genuine passion, authentic vulnerability, that a narcissist experiences often for the first time in his adult life, as something close to what real intimacy might feel like, even though he's fundamentally incapable of reciprocating it in kind. In the early stages of the relationship, this creates an intoxicating dynamic for both people, though for entirely different reasons. The empath experiences what feels like profound connection, finally meeting someone who seems to understand her on a level most people never reach. The narcissist experiences something closer to relief, a temporary reprieve from the persistent emptiness that defines his internal experience, made possible entirely through proximity to someone whose emotional world is rich enough to briefly fill the void he cannot fill himself. But this dynamic, however intoxicating initially, was never actually sustainable, because a narcissist's need for this borrowed emotional richness doesn't diminish over time. It intensifies because he's not developing any internal capacity of his own. He remains permanently dependent on external sources for the emotional experience he cannot generate independently, which means the empath's emotional depth transforms gradually from something genuinely appreciated into something increasingly, desperately mined, extracted, and consumed without any real reciprocity ever developing in return. Empaths interpret behavior generously, which creates dangerous blind spots. This second reason is crucial to understand, because it explains why empaths often stay in these relationships far longer than logic alone would predict, missing red flags that seem in retrospect glaringly obvious to outside observers. An empath's defining psychological trait isn't simply feeling emotions deeply. It's her tendency to interpret other people's behavior through a lens of compassionate context rather than surface-level judgment. When someone behaves cruelly, an empath's first instinct isn't to simply condemn the behavior. It's to search for the wound underneath it, the pain that might explain why someone would act this way, the context that might make an otherwise inexcusable action somehow more understandable. This tendency exists because empaths genuinely believe, often correctly in many contexts, that behavior stems from pain, that compassion extended toward someone's underlying wounds can sometimes produce genuine healing and change. This belief serves her well in countless relationships throughout her life, allowing her to build deep, meaningful connections with people who genuinely benefit from being met with patience rather than immediate judgment. But when this same interpretive generosity meets a narcissist, it becomes precisely the mechanism that prevents her from recognizing manipulation for what it actually is. Every red flag gets reinterpreted through a compassionate lens that explains it away. He was cruel because he's clearly dealing with unresolved childhood trauma. He lied because he's scared of vulnerability given his difficult past. He manipulated the situation because he genuinely doesn't know healthier ways to communicate his needs yet. This isn't naivety in any simple sense. It's the direct consequence of a sophisticated, usually accurate psychological framework being applied to someone who specifically doesn't fit its assumptions. Someone whose behavior isn't actually explainable through the lens of unprocessed pain-seeking healing, but through a fundamentally different psychological structure that experiences compassion not as an invitation to grow, but as an opportunity to be exploited further, precisely because it demonstrates exactly how much benefit of the doubt he can continue to extract before facing any genuine consequence. Empaths struggle to believe cruelty can exist without a redeeming explanation, and narcissists exploit that gap relentlessly. This third reason builds directly on the second, but deserves its own careful examination, because it reveals something even more specific about the psychological trap empaths repeatedly fall into. It's not simply that empaths extend compassion generously. It's that many empaths, especially those who haven't yet survived a relationship with a genuine narcissist, hold an almost foundational belief that pure, sustained cruelty without any underlying wound or redeeming context simply doesn't exist in most people. They believe, often correctly when applied to the general population, that even deeply flawed people are still fundamentally reachable, that somewhere underneath even difficult behavior lives a person capable of growth if given enough patience and understanding. This belief functions beautifully in ordinary relationships, allowing empaths to navigate normal human conflict with grace, patience, and genuine effectiveness. But narcissists specifically exploit this exact gap in an empath's worldview, because a narcissist's cruelty often genuinely doesn't stem from the kind of underlying wound that responds to compassion the way an empath assumes it should. His cruelty is frequently instrumental, deployed deliberately, strategically, specifically because it produces a desired result, rather than emerging from uncontrolled pain-seeking release. This distinction is nearly impossible for an empath to recognize in real time, precisely because her entire framework for understanding human behavior assumes cruelty must be explained by pain rather than motivated by calculated advantage. So she keeps searching for the wound that would make his behavior make sense within her existing understanding of how people work, extending patience toward a wound that either doesn't exist in the way she imagines, or exists but isn't actually driving the behavior she's trying to understand and forgive. This search can continue for years, sometimes an entire relationship's duration, because an empath's capacity to construct compassionate explanations is remarkably sophisticated and seemingly inexhaustible. Every new cruelty gets absorbed into an increasingly elaborate narrative designed to preserve her belief that this person is fundamentally reachable, fundamentally capable of change, fundamentally deserving of the patience she keeps extending, regardless of how much evidence accumulates suggesting otherwise. Empaths tend to prioritize harmony over confrontation, which narcissists learn to exploit systematically. This fourth reason addresses something slightly different from the previous three, because it focuses less on how empaths interpret behavior, and more on how they respond to conflict itself once it becomes undeniable. Many empaths, particularly those who develop their empathic sensitivity in childhood environments where conflict felt dangerous or destabilizing, carry a deep, often unconscious aversion to confrontation. This isn't weakness, it's frequently a sophisticated survival adaptation, developed specifically because conflict, in their formative environment, tended to produce outcomes worse than simply accommodating whatever tension existed rather than directly addressing it. Narcissists, whether through conscious strategy or simple instinctive pattern recognition, learn to identify this aversion remarkably quickly, often within the earliest stages of a relationship. And once identified, this aversion becomes an incredibly reliable tool, because it means an empath can be pushed significantly further than someone with a more natural comfort with confrontation, simply because she'll absorb far more discomfort before she's willing to risk the conflict that might come from directly addressing the problem. This creates a particularly insidious dynamic because it means the narcissist can gradually escalate problematic behavior, testing incrementally how much he can get away with before triggering the confrontation she's so eager to avoid. Each small escalation that goes unaddressed becomes tacit permission for the next slightly larger escalation, until behavior that would have been immediately unacceptable at the relationship's outset has become, through this gradual process, something she's somehow learned to simply absorb and accommodate instead. This is precisely why so many empaths describe feeling confused in retrospect about how they ended up tolerating behavior that seems, viewed from outside the relationship, obviously unacceptable from the very beginning. The escalation was never sudden, it was gradual, incremental, calibrated specifically to stay just below whatever threshold might finally trigger the confrontation she was working so hard to avoid, until the accumulated weight of everything she'd tolerated became genuinely staggering, even though no single moment along the way felt severe enough in isolation to justify the conflict she dreaded. Empaths often struggle to trust their own perception when someone confidently insists on a different version of reality. This fifth and final reason addresses something particularly insidious, because it strikes at the very foundation of how an empath navigates the world, her trust in her own perception and judgment. Many empaths, particularly those who grew up being told they were too sensitive or too emotional, carry a subtle but persistent uncertainty about whether their own instincts and observations can be fully trusted, especially when those instincts conflict with someone else's confident, insistent version of events. This vulnerability might seem separate from empathy itself, but it's actually deeply intertwined with it, because empaths, precisely because they're so attuned to other people's emotional states, often develop a strong instinct to prioritize harmony and connection over asserting their own perceptions, especially when doing so might create conflict or distress in someone else. This means that when a narcissist confidently insists that something she clearly remembers happened differently, or that her legitimate emotional response to his behavior is actually an overreaction, or that her accurate perception of a situation is somehow mistaken or unfair. Her instinct isn't necessarily to trust herself and hold firm. It's often to doubt herself, to wonder if she's misremembering, misreading, overreacting, precisely because she's spent her entire life prioritizing other people's emotional comfort over her own certainty about what's actually true. This vulnerability becomes the foundation for exactly the kind of sustained gaslighting so common in narcissistic relationships, because it means an empath is often more susceptible than average to gradually surrendering her own perception in favor of someone else's confidently insisted alternative version, especially when that surrender seems to restore harmony and reduce the conflict she instinctively wants to avoid. Together, these 5 mechanisms explain, with far more precision than vague notions of bad luck or poor judgment, exactly why empaths become such consistent, reliable targets for narcissistic exploitation. It was never about weakness. It was about specific, identifiable psychological traits, genuine emotional depth, compassionate interpretation of behavior, resistance to believing in pure cruelty, aversion to confrontation, and vulnerability to confident alternative narratives that happen to align almost perfectly with exactly what a narcissist needs in order to successfully extract what he cannot generate on his own. And here's where this entire understanding transforms from painful explanation into something genuinely useful. Because once you understand precisely which mechanisms made you exploitable, you gain something far more valuable than simple awareness. You gain the specific tools required to interrupt each mechanism individually, permanently, in a way that vague advice like, just set better boundaries, or learn to trust yourself, never quite manages to provide. Let's walk through what this actually looks like in practice, because understanding the problem clearly is only useful if it leads somewhere actionable. If your emotional depth was the resource being mined, the solution was never to diminish that depth, to become less feeling, less sensitive, less capable of genuine connection. That would mean sacrificing exactly the quality that makes your life rich, your relationships meaningful, your capacity for love so profound in the first place. Instead, the solution involves something more precise: learning to offer that depth selectively, deliberately, to people who have demonstrated genuine capacity for reciprocity, rather than extending it automatically to anyone who seems to want access to it. Your emotional richness remains fully intact. You simply stop handing it freely and immediately to people who haven't earned the right to receive it. If your compassionate interpretation of behavior created dangerous blind spots, the solution isn't to become cynical, to assume the worst about everyone, to abandon the generous, contextual understanding that makes you such a genuinely caring person in healthy relationships. The solution involves developing a more sophisticated framework, one that still holds space for compassion while also remaining alert to patterns rather than isolated incidents. A single instance of cruelty might genuinely stem from pain worth understanding. A consistent, repeated pattern of cruelty, especially one that intensifies specifically when you extend more grace rather than diminishing in response to your patience, is data that deserves to override your instinct toward generous interpretation, regardless of how uncomfortable that override feels in the moment. If your belief that cruelty requires explanation kept you searching for wounds that either didn't exist or weren't actually driving the behavior you were trying to understand, the solution involves learning to separate 2 distinct questions that empaths often unconsciously merge into one. The first question is whether someone's pain is real and worth compassion. The second, entirely separate question is whether that pain, real or not, justifies you continuing to accept harmful treatment. These questions can have different answers. Someone's wound can be genuinely real, genuinely worthy of compassion in the abstract, while simultaneously not obligating you to remain in proximity to behavior that continues hurting you, regardless of its origin or explanation. If your aversion to confrontation allowed gradual escalation to continue unchecked, The solution involves recognizing that confrontation and self-protection aren't actually the same thing, even though they can feel identical in the moment. You don't need to become someone who enjoys conflict, who confronts easily and comfortably, in order to interrupt this pattern. You simply need to develop the capacity to act on a boundary, even while the discomfort of potential confrontation remains present, rather than requiring that discomfort to disappear before you're willing to protect yourself. The confrontation aversion can stay. It simply stops being allowed to make your decisions for you. If your uncertainty about your own perception made you vulnerable to confidently insisted alternative narratives, the solution involves something that takes real time and real practice to develop, learning to trust the version of events you experienced in real time, before someone else had the opportunity to introduce doubt into your memory of it. This often means writing things down, sometimes literally, in the moment they happen, specifically so that your own contemporaneous account exists as evidence you can return to later, when someone else's confident alternative version starts to make you question whether you're remembering things accurately. Here's what becomes possible once all 5 of these mechanisms have been genuinely addressed. Not through becoming a different person, not through sacrificing the emotional depth and compassion that make you who you are, but through developing discernment sophisticated enough to protect that depth, rather than allowing it to remain permanently exposed and exploitable. You become someone narcissists can no longer easily identify as a target in the first place. Because remember, their entire selection process depends on reading specific signals, specific vulnerabilities, specific patterns of behavior that suggest exploitability. When those signals are no longer present, when your compassion comes paired with pattern recognition, when your emotional depth comes paired with selective access, when your aversion to confrontation no longer prevents you from acting in your own defense, when your trust in your own perception can no longer be easily eroded by someone else's confident insistence, you simply stop registering as viable prey. This is the ultimate answer to the question that started this entire conversation. You weren't targeted because something was wrong with you, because you were somehow weaker or more foolish than other people. You were targeted because you possessed specific, genuinely valuable qualities that happened to create exploitable openings that existed not because your empathy itself was flawed, but because it hadn't yet been paired with the discernment necessary to protect it. And once that pairing finally happens, once compassion meets wisdom, once emotional depth meets genuine self-protection, once your capacity for connection meets your capacity for boundaries, something remarkable occurs. You don't lose the qualities that made you an empath in the first place. You simply stop being exploitable for them. This is what real healing actually looks like. Not becoming harder, colder, more guarded in some permanent, indiscriminate way, but becoming someone whose extraordinary capacity for love, understanding, and connection finally comes paired with the wisdom to know exactly who deserves access to it. And once you become that person, fully and completely, you'll discover something narcissists already sense before you consciously realize it yourself. You're no longer their favorite target. You've become the one person their entire playbook was never actually built to handle.